Officials in the Department of Children have said in an internal briefing they're concerned about adult asylum seekers who claim to be minors. I'm joined on the line by Jack Power, acting Europe correspondent with the Irish Times, who has the story. Jack, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
So, do we have any idea as to the scale of this? How many people coming in are actually over 18 but claim to be under?
Yeah, we don't have any exact figures. I suppose to kind of put it in context and to kind of explain to people, what we're talking about here is what's referred to as unaccompanied minors. So this would be where somebody arrives in the country, they're under 18 and they don't have, guardians or parents with them, and then they will be referred to Tusla in the first instance there. So what the Department of Children officials are kind of flagging some concern about is that there are some people over the age of 18 who are adults claiming effectively to be unaccompanied minors.
Now,
and that this
go on.
And that this happens at the point of, when they arrive in the country, they'll be interviewed by international protection office officials who will, they will then claim asylum to them. And at that point, they'll say, oh, I'm 17 or I'm 16 or something to that effect. And this was flagged up. Now, we're probably dealing with quite small numbers. We've obviously seen, in the order of kind of tens of thousands of overall asylum seekers arrive in the country in the last 2 years. In the context, the amount of unaccompanied minors that Tusla have in their care at the start of this year was around 300. So that's in total. So you'd imagine a kind of a much smaller cohort of that number were these people who initially claimed that they were under 18, and then it later transpired after further interviews. They either reported afterwards that they were actually adults, or they were assessed by social workers to be adults after more lengthy interviews.
Now, it's notoriously difficult to assess the age of a teenager, be it a boy or a girl. Somebody arrives, a bearded youth, shall we say, arrives and claims to be under 18, but to all intents and purposes looks over 18, but may well be 16, whatever. So it is difficult to assess what the real age is if they don't have papers. What is the benefit to someone seeking juvenile status with Tusla rather than being into the mainstream asylum system?
Well, I suppose when Tusla take them into their care or their responsibility, they have an obligation to accommodate them. So that would obviously be one, big difference where we've obviously seen, particularly in the case of, single men, they've been kind of left on the streets, effectively. Single adult men have been kind of left on the streets where the Department of Integration haven't been able to offer them accommodation. So you imagine that might be one, I suppose, kind of benefit, that they would be offered accommodation by Tusla in often kind of care settings. They're often unregulated emergency kind of care placements that private care staff will run. And for obviously good reason, if as in the many cases that the person in question is 16 or 17, they're obviously much more vulnerable. And the state owes them a higher kind of duty of care than it would maybe even somebody who was 18, 19 or 20 or 25, obviously.
Now, do we know whether these are predominantly male applicants or female applicants?
It doesn't give much breakdown at all. It just kind of, the documents that we've seen that were released under the Freedom of Information Act to N2TD Pater Tobin, who shared them with the Irish Times, it only speaks to the problem in general. It doesn't get into too much specifics, but it does flag that, officials have been talking about this since about last October between the Department of Justice, the Department of Integration and the Department of and Tusla, I should say. So this has been something that's kind of been flagged on their radar, and the departments are basically trying to work more closely together to, they suggest, conduct more detailed interviews at the first instance. For example, when somebody says, I'm 17 or whatever, that maybe a more thorough interview will be conducted at that point to try and suss out, whether that is the case.
Now, do we know any information in what you've gleaned about the origin of these applicants? I mean, what countries are they from?
There's not a breakdown. Now, we do know that a large number of these unaccompanied minors, and I'm speaking generally about, the total number of unaccompanied minors who are deemed to be minors. A lot of them are coming from Ukraine and came from Ukraine in the months after the war. So that's making up a significant number of of these unaccompanied minors, there's not a breakdown or any kind of demographic details of this, I suppose, much smaller cohort, which are suspected to potentially be adults claiming to be minors. So we don't have, Tusla may well have internal figures, but they weren't included in the briefing documents that we obtained.
Now, do we don't have any great detail, it would appear, then, as to why Tusla are concerned. I mean, for example, if someone is a minor and they have no documentation one way or the other, but they claim to be a minor, you can't very well deport that minor because you're obliged to try and reunite them with their family. And also, in terms of your responsibility to children, you can't put them on the streets because they may be subject to exploitation and trafficking. So, I mean, that is a key issue for Tusla. Are they overburdened? Are they stretched by this particular problem?
Yeah, so as we've seen the general immigration the general asylum system, really kind of creak under the pressure of the last kind of 2 years when we've had a lot more numbers of arrivals come in. Similarly, Tusla's system for looking after unaccompanied child asylum seekers has come under, serious strain. It would have been dealing with very small numbers, 3 years ago. And those numbers have increased, I think Tusla told me, by 500% in the last 2 years, particularly, as I said, with more unaccompanied children coming from Ukraine and then other parts of the world. That this system is, really, really under strain. It's led to, these child asylum seekers being housed in inappropriate and unsuitable accommodation in some situations we found. And so I suppose this was one area where, potentially Tusla and the department were kind of flagging that this system is really under pressure as is. And this smaller cohort of adults claiming to be children and then ending up in the system until they were assessed.
It's a very challenging job for social workers, one suspects, trying to determine a child's age, if indeed they are children, without any documentation. I mean, you're trying to assess maybe educational achievement, personal histories and so on, and doing it maybe through a translator. Very, very difficult.
Yeah, you imagine it would be very difficult. And now Tusla did say, where there is a doubt, the benefit of the doubt is given to the asylum seeker. They don't want obviously a situation where, as a result of some interpretation error or something like that, some 17-year-old or vulnerable 16-year-old is inadvertently deemed to be an adult. So they don't want that to happen either. So they're obviously very careful in this. But I've spoken to people who carry out these assessments before, and they are actually surprisingly accurate, even in terms of just judging, somebody's kind of facial structure. And as you said, talking to this person about, their journey, how they got here, their family network, their level of kind of personal and social development. So, they are very experienced in judging this. But as you said, it's quite a difficult thing to be 100% sure that, this person is, as they say, they are 17, or as you potentially suspect, maybe they're 19. But yeah, Tusla say, and we're clear that where there is a doubt, the benefit of the doubt is given to the applicant to avoid a child being deemed an adult.
Finally, the quality of the accommodation that Tusla offers, I mean, is this privately contracted?
Yeah, so this is something that we in the Irish Times have been reporting on for the last 2 or 3 years, that this is kind of special emergency accommodation that has had to be kind of pulled together as a result of these increase in numbers. And often it's kind of bed and breakfasts with privately contracted care staff, or leased and rented accommodation with run by private companies. And we found several instances where this accommodation does not meet what would be anywhere close to the standards of a regulated, group care home or potentially kind of foster care. So there's serious question marks over the standard of accommodation that these child asylum seekers are put in as a separate point.
All right, Jack Power, acting Europe correspondent with the Irish Times. Jack, thank you very much for joining us.